Today we'll be talking dating for divorced or midlife singles with dating coach Tylar Dykman. For more than a decade, Tyler has been coaching corporate professionals in the field of organizational and change management. A couple years ago, she started working with renowned dating coach Logan Ury. And since then, Tyler has been guiding clients to finding long-term relationships. Even she used Logan to find her now fiance, Adam. Tyler, can you tell us a little bit more, I guess, about what you do?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me, Tina. I'm so excited to be here today on the podcast. As you said, a couple of years ago, we were coming out of the pandemic. I had been very single in New York for my entire 20s and early 30s. So a little different than the demographic today, but we'll talk a lot about what the differences are later on. And I knew that in my field of organizational psychology and change management, a lot of the challenge areas have to do with the person who is making the change themselves and not really the factors that surround them. And so I sat down with myself and I said, what can I do to change and hold myself accountable? And so I hired a dating coach, took a dating class, and realized pretty quickly that actually dating is relatively abnormal. And I know that like everyone's like, what? Dating's been around forever, but in today's world, it's pretty new, actually. If you think about the challenges of dating and the advent of apps and what that has done to change the dating landscape, it's really a new behavior that we're all navigating together collectively. And whether we're doing it well or not well, I think is something that is a new emergent field. So actually, I know 10 years ago, it was like, oh, are you on the apps, right? Back in the days of like Match.com and eHarmony coming into play. And Tinder came out in 2011. And so since then, we've seen a boon and a lot of social acceptance around dating apps. And I have a working hypothesis and theory that the new and next foray is actually going to be around dating coaching, where people will seek out help for accountability, for advice, to navigate this new land where you literally hear a new term every week. I'm sure we're all familiar with ghosting, then there's zombieing, and like the list goes on.
Heard about
all of these crazy things. I know.
Yeah.
And so staying on top of trends while also holding yourself accountable to the behavioral changes that you're making in yourself to either overcome dysregulated attachment styles or figure out your dating tendency and why you're chasing after one person and not the other, and what makes a good lifetime partner. All of these questions are things that a dating coach can help you sort through and really think through. And so when I work with clients, that's really the focus of the work, is helping them identify what are their blind spots, what are things that might be holding them back, and how can we work through it together.
It's very interesting what you said about how the dating landscape has changed. So for any of my younger listeners, I think pre-apps dating is really about, or actually even like for our parents, was more about who's nearby. So a lot of people married their secretaries or their assistants or whoever's near, someone that they worked with, someone that they lived in the neighborhood with, someone that they went to school with. So everything relating to physical proximity. And because of the apps, you have a wide variety of choices.
Yeah.
And as we know, when there's more choices, it makes things actually a lot more difficult. And then you start thinking about what parameters you want. And I think that we're going to cover that today. Yeah. I'll go into the first question. So apps or no apps? And I know that some listeners will be like, well, Tyler's only in her early 30s. So, but I think when it comes to behavior or how people, psychological reactions to any kind of relationship, that just is the same regardless of age. Hopefully you have experience that helps guide you, but we always need a coach. So question number one is, as a dating coach, how would you describe that it's different dating 40s and beyond, 40s, 50s, 60s, compared to someone in their 20s or 30s?
Yeah, there's a multitude of factors. And I should caveat, most of my clients that I work with actually are above the age of 40. So even though I might be in my early to mid 30s, it is something that I love. I love working with folks who are either newer on the dating scene, or maybe they were married before and they're starting to think through, like, what does it look like post divorce? And I would say that the biggest fundamental change is one that, like, the genders would feel, which is, unfortunately for women, we do have a biological clock, whether we like it or not. And there's a finite number of years that we can have children. And if something is very important to you, like having biological children, then I'd say that's probably the biggest thing that my clients who are in their 30s are feeling the pressure of. Whereas my clients in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, maybe they do want kids, but there's ways around it in terms of either adoption or non-biological children, or marrying into somebody who has kids from a previous relationship. There's a whole bunch of different gamuts. But I would say fundamentally, the differences in terms of, like, the dating behavior, if you will, is not that different, candidly. Like, people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s can still have dysregulated attachment systems. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, there's a great book called Attached, which talks about the 3 different attachment styles, which are anxious, secure, and avoidant. There's a 4th, which is like anxious and avoidant. And a lot of people feel like they fall into the anxious avoidant category or the dysregulated category. But it is a very narrow percentage of the population that is truly dysregulated. Sometimes when you fall into that and you're like, oh, I think I'm anxious avoidant, it might just be the wrong relationship that's bringing out that side of you. So one of the things that a lot of my clients in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I work with both men and women, a lot of them carry a lot of anxiety into the relationship that did not necessarily manifest before. But if you think about how attachment patterns form, and for those listeners who are not familiar with attachment theory, secure attachers are people who are very comfortable in attachment. So they'll fall into relationships easily. There won't really be a lot of friction. They like closeness, but they're also okay with, like, some distance. Anxious attachers are folks who really crave that closeness. And anxious attachers, and I self-proclaimed anxious attacher, so I'll out myself here. And I feel a deep love for all anxious attachers. We want the closeness. And we also operate from a couple of places of scarcity mindset, where we may worry that we're never going to find the partner or the one or whatever it may be. And sometimes that desire for closeness, if we feel someone slipping away, can manifest in some not so pretty protest behavior. I used to be a big protest behavior texter of walls of text if I was feeling something was off. Avoidance on the flip are people who want connection, want closeness, but when they get too suffocated, they're like, oh, I don't want this, and they'll push it away pretty immediately. And so you can see when you have 2 poles of the anxious and avoidant, like one who wants closeness, one who wants it but doesn't really want it, like they can get caught into this cyclical sort of like, I'm pulling you closer, I'm pushing you away, and I like the chase, and I like to be chased, anxious avoidant loop. And I would say that actually is prevalent no matter what age you are. So it can appear in your 40s, it can appear in your 50s, it can appear in your 60s. And if you were previously partnered, maybe you felt a sense of security in your relationship. And then all of a sudden you're cast into this dating world and you're like, oh gosh, what do I do here? And you're like, should I chase? Should I be chased? Do I want this? And your attachment style can change over time and change depending on who your partner is. I think there's one obviously that you gravitate toward, but you always want to find a partner who's going to help you feel more secure and centered in that relationship. And so I think that's the biggest crux. I think the other thing too is, as I said, dating apps are relatively new. I know that like the .com bubble of like online dating pre-existed Tinder, but the Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, Field, oh my gosh, there's like our time, 1,000,001 different apps that are out there. And it's like, how do I navigate this world of apps? What am I doing? How do I think about the paradox of choice? How many dates do I go on before I make it exclusive? I think all of these things are conversations in coaching sessions with my older clients where they're like, I have to navigate this world that did not exist when I was dating perhaps in my 20s.
Right.
And so I think those are kind of the biggest changes. Part of it is just technological education, or like, why do we like one app better than another? Like I always say, I prefer Hinge to anything else because it's a 2-click action versus any of the swiping apps where it gamifies it and it just becomes like something to do on the toilet. Uh, for those of you,
That's so funny. I think that's what happens.
It's totally true. So at 15 minutes, you're like, all right, I'm in the bathroom. Let me go like swipe. But Hinge at least has some intentionality behind it. You can send a message, and I think it really does kind of give people that picture of who are they matching with, as well as some intentionality behind it.
Can we go back to what you're saying about the types, like the type of attachment?
Yeah.
If you were to think about memes when they talk about men and women dating, like more in the cisgender world, that it's usually women who get attached quicker and men, like, sending the 10-page text, and the men who might just disappear. But are you saying that that's not necessarily true, even though that's like how you think of memes about dating?
Yeah, it's totally not true. I actually work with a number of anxious men and avoidant women, believe it or not. Like it's interesting. And I think it just is a matter of how they communicate. And a lot of this boils down candidly to how you're showing up on the date. What questions are you asking? Are you interested in what the person is saying? Or are you just, sitting on a perch and being interesting? And I think there's a serious difference in those two responses or ways of operating on the date. And I don't think that, I know for a fact, attachment style is not gender dictated. In fact, like it comes from your childhood mostly. So there was a psychological experiment that was run with babies where their parent would leave them in a room. Secure babies, when the parent left, the baby would self-soothe. They'd cry a little, but they'd be able to self-soothe. Anxious babies would be left and they'd cry and cry and cry because they would fear that their parent would not come back to them. Avoidant babies would show no emotion when their parent left or when their parent came back. It would just be like, they're gone. And that's kind of where it is. So these are
interesting. It's not nurtured that way. It's almost upbringing enhances, but it doesn't necessarily determine that. So
and I would say too, born. Like you're based on your experiences, your attachment style might change. Like I've shifted mine candidly. Like my attachment style pre-Adam was very anxious. And then because he's a securely attached partner, he's made me feel extraordinarily secure in our relationship to the point where I'm not stressing if he's out on a boys' night being like, oh, I haven't heard from him in 2 hours. In fact, I'm like, oh, good, he's gone. So I can go watch my Bravo TV and unplug. But like, that's something that I would offer too, for all those who are anxious or avoidant attachers. And they're saying, oh my gosh, how can I fix this dysregulated attachment style? It can get better. The key is finding someone who will bring out the more secure side of yourself versus somebody who's going to exacerbate the
That's really helpful.
style.
No, because in case someone has had not great relationships, that their behavior is not necessarily determined by that's the way they always are, but also the chemistry between the two people determines how you might react. Can we go back to the question, especially with someone who's older, not used to how you said, how you present yourself? Can you talk about ideal ways to present yourself in a dating profile? Because let me just add in, like I've heard male friends say, it's like, I don't even read the stuff. I just look at the pictures and I'll read the stuff later if I like her. So, so I'm curious about how to present yourself in a dating profile.
Totally a great question, and one that I love to work on with clients of mine. I usually do like a whole dating app revamp, and everyone comes in and they're like, I have the great dating app. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, great, show it to me and let's discuss. So things that I always say is your dating app is your front page of your newspaper, right? Like you are going in there and you're saying, who am I? And it really should present different facets of yourself. So the exercise that I usually take my clients through is journal out the top 3 things that you want to communicate about yourself, of things that are important to you. So if it were me at this point, I'd be like, okay, I have a dog. He's really important in my life. I need to showcase him in some way. I love going to the gym. That's really important to me, and the health and wellness aspect. And I'm a huge book nerd. So I read a lot. How can I communicate that out about myself? And once I've kind of constellated on the big three, it's about getting really specific because the app is not meant to be a catch-all. Now, I know that a lot of people are like, well, dating's a numbers game. How can I get my numbers up? It's really not about that. It's about turning the right people on and the wrong people off. And so if you create your dating app profile in a way that is bold and makes big claims, like let's say I put out there that 19th century British literature really gets my gears going. And if you want to talk about Thomas Hardy, I'll be yours all day. That is a very specific kind of feeler that's going to get put out there. And I'm probably not going to match with somebody who's going to be like, well, who the heck is that? And that's kind of what you're going for when you put out your dating profile. The other thing I usually see when I get people's profiles to review is that they'll put things on there that are repetitive. So the one example I'll use is let's say you have a dog like me and you make your entire profile about your dog. All I know about you is you have a dog. And that's not telling me a lot other than if I'm not a dog lover, don't get on board this ship. And so I think it's really about finding those things that make you interesting, unique, that you want to put out in the world, that are important to you to go share with a partner. And then on the date, make it as non-interviewee as possible. I think that's the other big piece of advice that I will impart is it's a date. It should be fun. It's not an interview. Don't sit across from one another and be like, so what do you do? Instead, ask things like, what are you passionate about? What gets you out of bed in the morning? If you had to describe your ideal day, what would you be doing? I think those are much more telling responses than, oh, I do XYZ for work and my favorite color is purple and I like to go down to the shore in the summer. I think it's one of those things and it's so obvious, I feel like saying it out loud, but a lot of times you get into these dating situations and your nerves are on high and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I talk about? What's taboo? What's not taboo? The best piece of advice that I can impart to you is one, be yourself. You should never show up to a date pretending to be somebody else because that's going to hurt your chances of success. If you're yourself at the outset, you don't have to pretend to be somebody. And then on date 3, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can take this fake version of myself off and become somebody that I actually am. Instead, it's put yourself out there, put your whole self out there. And if they don't like it, that's okay. That's not your person. And you hope that the person on the other end is doing the same thing where they're their whole selves and you can get to know them. And this way, you're coming into it saying, this is who I am. I think post-pandemic, we've all kind of been through the ringer. And so vulnerability is sexy. Vulnerability is in. A lot of people put on their dating profile that they're in therapy. I'm like, yes, go for it.
Oh, I didn't know
great.
people did that.
Oh, yeah. And they have a higher match percentage when they do. So that's the other tidbit is vulnerability is really in vogue. Highly encourage that and highly
it seems counterintuitive to be vulnerable. So the thing you said about profile, it made me think of how even a business coach would tell someone in their, for example, Instagram profile, is that you want to niche down. So we were thinking, no, I want to appeal to I don't know who I might find, but by listing out specific things about you that's really different, that's not, I feel like the common things are, I love going out with my friends. Who doesn't? I love to travel. Who doesn't?
Yeah.
I love to laugh. Who doesn't? But really niching down in what makes you different. If you are a bookworm, to talk about that, because there's a lot of people these days who don't read and they maybe prefer a podcast. But not that would. But you might have that in common. But that's really interesting to get very nichey about.
Yeah, and I always love the
yourself.
ones when people tell me they love travel. I'm like, okay, tell me a country that you really love, or tell me a restaurant in a city that you've been dying to try, right? Then you start going down the path of something specific, because really what a good profile will do is hook someone in with oh, I want to talk about that. And if you don't have that hook or you don't have that invitation, it's really hard, because to your point, how many profiles say, I want someone kind and empathetic with a growth mindset, or
we also want to hire that person too.
Exactly.
Okay, that's very helpful. Let me go on to maybe getting a little bit more specific to what would be common in mid-age is, how would someone who's divorced with kids handle their dating, either with someone else who's divorced with kids or other single folks? But the idea of having kids and being divorced, that you're not coming into it's not baggage, but in some ways you have some history that someone else who has never been married might not have.
Yeah. And this is where I couch it in vulnerability is really important, because you're navigating a landscape where you have something where you can't be as flexible, right? Like as an untethered person who does not have kids, you have greater flexibility because you're not worrying about whose weekend or weekday is on or off, or where do I need to be to do pickups or drop-offs. And I think that it's a totally valid question, and one that comes up a lot. I find that a lot of the coachees that I work with who have children tend to date others who have children, just because it's like an easier conversation to navigate.
Yeah.
Of like, I have a kid, you get it, this is how it goes. But if you're dating somebody who doesn't have kids, I think being upfront about that is really key. And also clarifying with the person who you're dating, like, they're not going to meet your kids until you're ready to have them meet your kids. And I think that's a really important thing that comes up a fair amount of, like, how soon should I introduce? How late should I introduce? Like, what makes the most sense? And it's really up to the person and what they feel comfortable with, but also what their ex-partner, who's also the children's parents, feel comfortable with too. I think it's like a shared conversation of like, do we introduce people to the kids when we're really serious? Do we introduce people to the kids to somebody we're casually dating? Like, these are all conversations that I think if you're in a co-parenting situation, you should have some clarity on if you're in a healthy talking place with your ex-partner.
Yeah.
And then with your current partner that you're dating or somebody that you're going on a date with, I think lead with that vulnerability. Say like, I do have the obligations of my kids' insert schedule here. And so I may not be as flexible. It's not that I'm not interested. It's just I have to balance kind of my cadence with my family and with the life that I want to lead. And I think anybody worth their salt will respect the crap out of that and will say, this is great. And like, thank you so much for sharing. And if they don't, then again, they're not your person, right? Like, we're in the game of like, how do we find the people that our pox and all, our scars are coming through and we feel good about that and they feel good about that, versus somebody who's going to admonish or not accept or whatever it may be. Because I think that kids are huge. They're a huge part of your life. And like, you can't just throw them by the wayside to go have a good time. So you want to find somebody who's going to be compatible with that, and find somebody who's really going to allow you to navigate that water of like being a parent while also being a single human.
It sounds like this is also a time where having a dating coach is helpful, because as you were describing that, I was thinking how, and no matter what you're doing, how communication is key. And probably the hardest thing about dating is the idea of not being afraid to tell someone that, without thinking, what if this person's great, but what if this turns them off?
Yeah.
And while logically we know that it is better to communicate, but we know in our work lives and everything else in life how communication usually is where all the friction comes from between people, dating or not dating. So, and I think it sounds like as a coach, part of what you do is help people. It's kind of like what a therapist does. They're like, you could say it this way and present the situation, and then how people realize it is better to say something than to not say something.
100%. And I also think too, like, let's say as you're thinking of your big three for your dating app profile, your kids come up, because oftentimes they do, right? They're a big part of people's lives. Then they should be on the profile somewhere, or some allusion to the kids should be on the profile somewhere. If you don't feel comfortable putting photos of your kids up, which I totally get, totally understand, at least some line of like, I enjoy being a great dad, or I enjoy being a great mom. And like, that's a very open, easy way to say like, I am a parent and I am letting you know.
Yes. Yeah. So my next question, actually, I think someone had asked this when I posted this on my social. What if you're not attracted immediately, but the date has many other traits you like? And I know that,
this.
And that's hard. Like, you don't know when to write that off and when to keep moving on.
Yeah. So there is a concept that Logan actually coined, and I'm going to drop an F-bomb, so listeners, you're warned, called fuck the spark. The spark is bullshit, candidly. I know that a lot of people are like, oh no, it's like lightning strikes. And like, to go into some of the theory behind this, there's three types of dating tendencies that people have. The first is the maximizer. I am also a maximizer. We're checklist people. We have like a million and one parameters. We're like, if they don't meet all of my qualifications, then they're not it for me. And like, I know that sounds harsh or callous. Most of the time, men tend to be maximizers, but I'm finding that more women in business or maximizer tendencies are coming out. And so if you're someone who like spreadsheets before a vacation or needs to be extraordinarily planned and thoughtful, you're probably a maximizer and you fall into that camp. And the challenge for the maximizer is they have unrealistic expectations of their partner. And the thing that I would say to them is like, you're not perfect yourself. I know that is like a hard pill of humble pie to swallow, but have some grace for somebody else in the equation too. Because if you're not perfect and they're not perfect, you two imperfects can make a whole perfect match no matter what. And so their biggest fear is settling, but I challenge you all to satisfy. And what I mean by that is like, satisfy there's some of the requirements, but like find satisfaction in the relationship itself in looking for somebody who's kind, empathetic, growth mindset oriented, all of the good things that we know make good partnership, and focus a little less on some of the checklisty things. The second dating tendency are my romanticizers. I call them the Disney lied to us people. They want like the meet cute. They want the butterflies and like, you know, sparkles to emerge when they meet their person and the like heart eyes, awooga. They're the people who have the unrealistic expectations around relationships themselves. And so for them, they want everything to be easy. They want to feel instantaneous attraction. They want to feel like everything is smooth. And we all know, for those of us who are partnered, relationships are not easy. There is a lot of communication and a lot of work that goes into making one healthy and successful. And so if they're going in with this sort of like, I'm never going to date unless I have this sort of rom-com-esque meeting story or something cute to put on our wedding website, that's going to be their pitfall. And so my biggest piece of advice to romanticizers is try to focus on aspects of the relationship where you can build a relationship together that you want. And it might feel like a meet cute later on. The third type is my hesitators. And so they're people who are I will date when I lose 10 pounds. I will date when I lose, or when I earn X amount of dollars. That was a total flub.
Or when I have more time.
Yeah. When I have more time, whatever. They make every excuse in the book because they have unrealistic expectations of themselves. And so for hesitators, the biggest thing is just get out there, do the thing. And that's like the hardest one to do because it's so scary and you don't want to get hurt. And you're like, well, if I put it off, they're not going to pick at my insecurity. And I say all this because all three types tend to have this sort of like, I don't know about what I call a slow burn. And a slow burn is somebody who maybe on the first date, you're like, they're interesting, there's something here, but like, I don't know if I feel that spark, or which is usually what people are alluding to when they say attracted. And I always say, go on the second date. Make the second date your default. Try and get out there because the first date you're going in, nerves are high. People don't have the best limbic system mitigation on the first date. They're all anxious. They're like, I'm going to talk too much. I'm going to say the wrong thing, whatever. Second dates are much better for really judging, do I feel attraction here? And a lot of the times I get questions of like, well, how many dates do I need to go on to know whether it's a slow burn or I'm just not feeling it? And I say like,
that's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. I usually say like 4 to 5 and people are like, whoa, that feels like a lot. But quite candidly, a slow burn can take some time to open up and it can take some time to get to know somebody. I think in today's world, we're very quick to say, date one, didn't feel it, going to call it, because we live in a world of immediate gratification, right? Like we can order groceries on our phone. We can get takeout in 5 minutes or less. Like it is go, go, go all the time, especially in the New York metro area where like hustle culture is tantamount to life. letting somebody show you who they are, really building the connection. And there's a tool actually called the Post-Date 8, which if you Google Logan Ury and Post-Date 8, those 8 questions will appear. And I'll link them in the podcast episode below as well for those who are curious. Put those in a spreadsheet somewhere. After every single date, answer all 8 questions. It will help you not only get into your body and think about how did you physically feel on the date, which a lot of people have a hard time with, connecting mind and body, but it'll also give you sort of the guiding posts of like, should I see this person again? And the word of caution I always give people is like, unless the date was atrocious, like let's say they said something absolutely repugnant or they were rude or who knows what, the default should always be to the second date, just to try and see if there is connection that you can build with somebody who before the first date was just an internet stranger. And I think that that's like really key.
Even getting to know friends. It takes a year to like really get to know people. So
I think
you're
there was
right in that.
Some stat
that by writing off a date after the first one, it's not fair. Because I can think of it even like coworkers that you might not have liked when they first started or you first started, met them, and then as you had more exposure to them, you might have changed your mind. Even though we like to give weight to the idea of trust your gut instinct. Yes.
No, the first meeting is like 0.005%, I think, overall the time you will spend with this person if you wind up partnered with them. So I always say the first date is like a wash, which I know people are like, what? And I think it takes, I believe there's a stat out there, it's something like 120-ish hours to really get to know somebody. So if you haven't spent that much time, and like there's another dating coach, her name is Matchmaker Maria. She has like, a 12 date rule, which is basically like, don't sleep with somebody until you're 12 dates in. I don't agree with that. I think you can sleep with somebody whenever you want, but like, or when you feel ready for that.
Yeah.
But her point being is like, you don't really know somebody just based on a couple of hours of getting to know them. So take the time and get to know them on a deeper level.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I can't see in today's world, Gen Z doing that, but I don't know, maybe an older generation, but that seems like a long time. But I also see the logic behind it. So in giving people chances, how do you weigh or know if something's a red flag? Like you feel gut wise, this is a red flag. Is this relevant? Is this something I can overcome? Can you discuss the idea of red flags?
Yeah. Oh, I love this question too. Okay. So there's a podcast I listen to and they play this game, Red Flag or Deal Breaker, which always cracks me up.
That's exactly what we're asking. What's a red flag? What's a deal breaker?
Exactly. And it's going to depend, right? Like I think everybody is different on their deal breakers, but I always say get really crystal clear on deal breakers. And what I mean by that is like, I was working with a client and they were like, well, going to university is an absolute deal breaker. I need somebody who's college educated. And I was like, okay, let's talk a little bit more about that. Help me understand what is the driving factor in that, because you're cutting off a lot of people if you are not, putting you're not casting a wide net. And they were saying that what they really were looking for is somebody who's intellectually curious, who's well-read and well-rounded. And I was like, well, does a college education necessarily like couch with that? And I know that like, yes, it definitely does help. And people who are college educated will definitely have those qualifications in some cases, but not everyone. And what we kind of got down to was the granular thing that this person was looking for was an intellectual. And so when you start to think about your person or your traits of somebody that you want to be with, the things that we think matter actually don't. Attractiveness, surprisingly, does not matter as much. Like, yes, you should be somewhat attracted to somebody. Like, I'm not suggesting like date somebody who you don't want to like see naked, but it doesn't really matter as much in the long term. Instead, what I think matters is somebody who exhibits growth mindset. And what I mean by that, there's this famous psychologist, Carol Dweck. She wrote a book called Mindset, where she studied gifted and talented kids in elementary and grade school, basically. And the GT kids who emerged into the real world basically because they were raised in an environment where you were given, if you had the right answer, you were right. That was rewarded. They actually entered into the real world with what's called a fixed mindset, meaning that they are there is a binary, there is good and bad, there is yes and no, and that is it. And if they hit a place where they had to try or work at something, it was really hard for them to accept failure and overcome that. Whereas you had kids whose parents celebrated the journey or studying and the like lifelong trajectory of them getting to the place where they got to, and they emerged into the adulthood with what's called a growth mindset. Somebody who is embracing failure fast, somebody who can think through things and not just necessarily get stuck and mired in that sort of, I was wrong and now I have to pivot space. So that matters probably most. I would rank growth mindset in a partner like highest of the highs amongst good communicator and all of that good stuff. Finances don't really matter as much either. I think what matters there, because a lot of people are like, oh, I want to date somebody who earns X amount or who makes the same as me or whatever it may be, because I have a lifestyle that I want to upkeep and they have, I don't want them to impugn on mine. And I think that the thing that I coach people on there is it's not really the money, it's how you see the value of a dollar that matters more.
Yes. Yep. Because someone can make a lot of money, but they could just they're just constantly spending. And that's
exactly. So it's like, do we
having
see
the same money philosophy?
100%. Do we see money the same way? Do we feel the same way about it? The other things that are like hard and fast deal breakers, religion tends to be a big deal breaker. But I think, again, getting clear on it. Are you someone who feels really strongly about going to a place of worship on the weekends? If yes, like you probably don't want to match with an atheist. And that should be something that you put up again in your big three. And then finally, politics in today's world tend to be a pretty heavy discourse. It's just kind of the way of the world. But I will caution folks that sometimes people on dating apps put that they're moderate. And what they mean by that is that they're like not fans of taxes because they probably make a fair amount, but they will be socially liberal. So like, don't write moderates off because you never really know. And that's kind of the other thing where when you're matching with somebody or you're asking questions on a date, this is where it's so great to be as interested as possible. Ask those powerful questions that don't feel interviewee, but you get to know the heart of the person. As far as like, how do I overcome kind of like looking for the spark or whatever it may be? I think like kindness is also a really key thing. Like if they're not kind, then like they're probably not going to be a kind long-term partner. And so that's something to look out for too, that I would say is a pretty heavy deal breaker. But really,
like kindness is so overrated. People don't
overrated.
You want your partner to be a kind person. It will help you when you're sick. And that's not something I feel like you can always teach. Maybe manners you can teach, but not kindness.
Exactly. Like there are things that are like pet peeves maybe, but not deal breakers. Like maybe, I don't know. I'm trying to think of one of my pet peeves. I remember I was like thinking through what would be something that would annoy me that wouldn't be like a damaging deal breaker. I was like kind of waffling for a while. I will tell you just to open up to the listeners, I had some shallow things about me when I was dating too. And I had written off people who were like maybe balding. And I was like, oh, I can't see myself being attracted to them. And then my world was totally blown up when I had a coworker who like I'd gotten to know over time. And I was like, oh, they're actually kind of cute and they didn't have hair. So you know what? Like our type, what you think you know your type is, you don't. If you had told me that I would have wound up with a 5'11" redhead, I would have told you you're crazy, but that's where we are in this life. And so I think that we put a lot of emphasis as a society and also in our dating lives of like, how do I pick somebody who's like hot enough or who's insert adjective here enough? When really we should look for who's somebody that's going to make me happy, who's somebody who's kind, who's thoughtful, who's showing up consistently, who's learning with me, who's, brave in the face of adversity, who doesn't really get their feathers ruffled. I think all of those things, emotional regulation, all of that makes for a better partner from a predictive standpoint than like, oh, well, they weigh X amount and they have hair and like all of this stuff that really doesn't matter in the end.
Yeah. Some of those traits, I think you don't realize you'll value until maybe experienced with in other relationships, or you meet someone who has these traits that you've not formally been involved with, and you're like, oh my God, I really like how this makes me feel, or how our relationship is because of these traits, like kindness.
100%.
So how, in this era of like so many choices, how do you sort through the swipes on who to meet and who not to meet?
Yeah. Well, if you're architecting your profile in the way that I said, you're going to actually notice probably a dip in who matches you. And that's normally the number one complaint. When I start working with somebody, we re-alter their profile, they're like, I'm not getting as many likes. And I say, that's a great thing, because that means that we're doing our job of turning the wrong people away from us, and the right people will come to our front door. I always say that on the apps, the goal of the app is to not have a pen pal. You want to get to the date as fast as possible.
I love it. Don't have a pen pal. You want to meet.
Yeah, exactly. I want a date, not a pen pal. And when you're going through and you're matching with somebody, let's say you match with somebody, it should be a quick back and forth. And what I mean by that is, like, I say, hey, tell me something you're passionate about. You answer. Then I ask you another question, or answer your question back, because hopefully they've asked you the question back. And then we go back and forth maybe 2 more times, and then set a date. Send a number, set a date. And the reason why I tell and advise clients to do that is because the faster you move off the apps, the more that person becomes real. And I would advise against a lot of texting before you meet up. I say that because there's this psychological phenomenon called the Monet effect. We all know Monet, Impressionist painter. When you're up close, it's a bunch of little dots, but from far away, it looks beautiful. Well, the same thing happens when you text back and forth forever. Far away, they might look really witty and funny and awesome. And then you meet them, and maybe they are so boring.
It's a big mess. The Monet effect. That's from a movie. They're like, she's a Monet.
Exactly.
Like, looks gorgeous from that's a really, I think that is a mistake people have in the continuing of conversation, because some people are not on the app for the purpose of actually meeting. So that in itself, you're saying, is a red flag. Someone who's not willing to meet right away, and they just continue to try to have a conversation.
Oh, that's a deal breaker. I would tell my clients, unmatch that person. If they're not meeting up with you after a quick back and forth, like, as much as like, it pains me to say this, we're post-pandemic, like, people are out there meeting in the wild, meeting people again. Like, you need to move from app to date as quickly as you possibly can. And I'm not saying like it needs to happen that day, but within the week, right? Like, match, talk back and forth a little bit. They're not a psycho. You're not a psycho. Go out on the date. Just because if you sit there and you text forever, that's like wasting time. And the sunk cost value of that relationship is going to elevate the more that you like put it off. You're like, well, I'm investing all this time and building this narrative with this person that I haven't met up with yet. And then you're like, perhaps
you're
building
the potential
for other options
to be more disappointed too.
Exactly.
This actually, what you're saying, leads on to a question someone had sent in on my social.
Yeah.
So what if you go on a date, you meet someone, they're a really nice person. Then you go on another first date and you really like them. Maybe you like them for different reasons. So all the positive traits, one could be you like the intellect, one's physical attraction, one has similar interests. And after you go on 4 first dates like that, how do you know who to call for a second date? Basically, all these choices, what does one do?
Yeah, I think that's really
finite time.
It's really tough because it sounds to me like this person is getting different things from each. And this person is probably going to hate me for my recommendation, but go on the second date and see if there's another layer that you uncover with each of these people. Now, I will say, if like the only thing going for the person with physical attraction is physical attraction and you were bored to tears on that date, don't go on the second date. Like, I know it's going to hurt because you're like, but they're super attractive. Nope. I would just say, if that's all that there is going for them, you're not going to be sitting around a fire like later in life talking about anything. You're just going to be sitting in silence and staring at somebody whose looks may have like changed in their later years. So I always say,
or you get bored, or anything that's great, even eating the same delicious meal, it's just human nature that you don't notice it as much. And that's where what the connection is much more relevant.
Exactly. I would say go out with the ones who are igniting your brain, who are like making you feel excited to talk about something, who can hold your attention, because the data shows that you spend so much time with your partner, and it's the most important life decision that you can possibly make in your life, especially when thinking about the later half of your life. You're really looking for companionative love. And like finding that person who will be there with you when you want to travel, who will support your career aspirations, retirement aspirations, everything in between, and really go on that journey of that later in life kind of cycle with you. And if you're going out with them and they're like boring as a doornail, but super hot, that's not really going to produce companionative love. It's going to produce lust, and lust fizzles. As much as we all think and delude ourselves that it doesn't, it does. And you want at the end of the day, someone who's your best friend, who you can come home to and like have fun with. That being said, there is this concept too called other significant others, which is not like somebody that you're dating multiple people. It's not dabbling into poly. I know a lot of folks who are perhaps divorced I've been hearing a trend now that more people are starting to like dip a toe into the like non-monogamy pool. I'm going to couch that for another podcast episode.
I was going to actually, that was a question by someone about what if your post, we'll make it another question, who's just like, I don't really want a serious relationship. After being divorced with kids, I just want to go and have a good time.
Oh, definitely. Go do you. I always say it's like, New York's a big city, any big city or small town, you can go have a fun time. And it always helps to kind of like heal from that. But I would say back to the person who's like going on those dates, like it's kind of one of those things where if you're feeling anxious about too many choices, the other thing I would offer as a piece of advice is don't date more than 2 people at once.
Now that's a really nice parameter.
Yeah.
So, because you can go on the app and constantly find someone else and it just feels like where to go. But if you're keeping a certain limit, that allows you to eliminate before going, that's okay. I like that.
Because a lot of times
boundary.
It's like, you can't keep all of your facts straight to do a multi-dating situation with more than 2 people. And I know people are going to be like, no, I can totally do it. The data and the science shows that 2 people is probably the safe bet of keeping things straight in your head of who said what to whom. And I can tell you a funny story that I totally flubbed that, because at one point I was dating 3 people at once and I sent a meme to somebody that like had not had that inside joke with me. And I was like, I thought we talked. I was mortified. I was like, oh my God, I have messed this up entirely.
Yeah.
Deeply embarrassing moments. And so my rule of thumb is like, if I have clients who come to me and they're like, Tyler, I am just so overwhelmed. I keep going on first dates. I can't keep it straight. No more than 2 people. And it's okay to let people sit in the apps and not converse with them until you're ready to converse with them. I think, again, going back to immediacy culture, like don't let a conversation that's open sit for more than 24 hours, but also like you can control the flow of how many people you're matching with. And I would highly encourage you to do that so that you don't get overwhelmed.
I love this. Now I think about that example as when people try to manage their time and work and you time block. This to me is like dating time block. You're like, okay, just focus on this.
Yes.
And then you can also move on. But you know how some people also time block by not checking their emails all the time, just doing it certain times a day. Yeah. And that's what you're doing by keeping the pool of people, by not answering right away because you're trying to time block with 2 people at a time. That's great. So a lot of things that happen in regular life apply in the dating world.
Very much so. And that's because dating is a part of life. I know it's like kind of new, kind of weird. Like, do we go on a dinner date for a first date? Do we do drinks? Do we do coffee? No coffee dates. Please stop coffee dating. It is not sexy.
Oh, wait, why? Can you tell me about that?
Yeah.
Why not coffee dates? I just assumed that would be like no pressure.
I know. A lot of people do. I used to be a proponent of coffee dates, but coffee dates are the death knell of building intimacy for some reason. So I have foregone them. Like
that's interesting. Okay.
A lot of the date is set in settings. So you want to find a space where you can sit, where it feels datey and it feels intimate. The other thing too is there's sort of like seating politics where you never want to be across the table from somebody that you're on a first date with because it feels like an interview.
Okay.
Instead, trying catty corners. So if you can go to a bar where they have like a booth in the back and you're sitting side by side, immediately it creates that aura of like, this is a date. This feels fun. It feels intimate. It feels sexy. And you want to create those spaces because that's going to allow you to, again, get into your body, feel things a little bit differently versus like, oh, we're in broad daylight and everybody can see everything and it does not feel sexy or cool or fun. And so I always give the word of like, you know, go to a bar, go somewhere that feels like more romantic, or go on something where you have a third object and it can be fun. So there's like, in New York, there's a mini golf place called Swingers, which is like very funnily named, but it's a great first date spot because you have 18 holes of mini golf in a ridiculous environment. It's dark, it's competitive, it's fun. Great first date.
I preferred activities on a date when I was dating, just because then it didn't feel interviewy. You didn't have to look in someone's face. I didn't like having a dinner because you feel like the dinner is still an interview.
You're like, how much longer do we need to sit here? No.
And stare into each other's eyes, even though we don't really know each other.
We're just internet strangers having a meal.
That's right.
Yeah.
I have one last question to wrap it up. What are the gender-specific challenges?
Yeah, it's so funny because everyone's like, it must be easier for men or it must be easier for women. And like, the funny thing is, it really boils down to like, it's just hard to find connection in today's world. Like, I hate to end on that kind of like bleak note. And I don't think that there is a ton of gender specific challenges other than if you're in your early 40s as a woman and you do want biological children and you're like racing against the clock. That could be something that I would say would be a gender specific challenge. But beyond that, really, I think the challenges are very similar insofar as like they're communication based, they're connection based, they're how do I find the matches that I want to go out with? How can I, continue to further the connection? How many first dates is too many first dates? Or I didn't feel a spark, but we all know, fuck the spark. We're all going to be saying that after this episode.
Fuck the spark.
And so I think that like those are the things that manifest and there's no real gender attribution, which is a beautiful thing. But I also know that like some people may be like, well, I want some concrete answers because I'm a woman in my, insert age here, or I'm a man in my insert age here. There's not a huge difference. It's just a matter of like that. How do we find
everyone
connection?
has the same challenge. And it's really about, like you said, the challenge of finding a connection in this life that we live in.
Exactly.
Even with friendships. Thank you so much, Tyler.